Thank you, everyone. I'm Scott Wynn, the CEO, co-founder of Bodhi. We are a software that helps residential solar companies deliver amazing customer experiences. Welcome to our Q2 customer success webinar. This is the second one we've been able to do. But before we begin the presentation itself, we've got to answer the joke of the day. So, April showers bring May flowers. But what do May flowers bring? Pilgrims!
Yay.
The funny thing about this joke is that I think historically we've always done these dad jokes at the beginning of our webinars. This one here was given to me by my 9-year-old kid. So if anyone else has some fun jokes that they like to provide us and to use at the beginning of webinars, feel free to enter those into the chat or to just send us a message directly. But let's go ahead and get into this. Today, we're going to talk about what homeowners really want. So we're going to be joined today by Yana, who is our head of customer success. And she's, you guys, everyone in there in the audience probably knows of Yana as this kick-ass CRM software guru who knows all about Salesforce and all the other CRM tools out there, along with understanding processes and customer journeys and such. But there are a couple of other things that you guys may not know about Yana. One, she is a art history. She has a master's in art history. So that's one pretty interesting thing. But the one that I think was most compelling, I think this is why we hired her back in the days. She is an Apple genius. So she worked at the Apple store. So I'm not sure if she will provide some iPhone or Mac support for y'all, but maybe if you're really, really nice to her, she might. So with that, I'm going to hand this conversation over to Yana. But before we do that, she's going to go into a lot of the details on customer journeys, how to start to figure that out. But we want this to be interactive. So if you do have questions, please enter them into the Q&A section. And Katerina, if you're back there, can you make sure that the Q&A section is enabled for folks to be able to ask questions into the Q&A? And if you like, you can use the chat function to just provide some commentary or insights among the audience itself. And then what I'll also do is towards the end of the conversation, we'll also have more of a Q&A session segment as well. So please, if you do have questions, feel free to just add them to the conversation that we have right here to the dialogue. But if you want to hold to the end, we're going to have a section for that as well. So Yana, let me hand this over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I was really hoping you wouldn't mention the genius thing because now I'm going to get bombarded with a bunch of requests. But I could take apart a MacBook. At the peak of my genius ability, I could take it apart in exactly 8 minutes. So fun fact. Awesome. So thanks everybody for attending our webinar. We're gonna get into a little bit what we're gonna talk about today, but I really wanna start off, as I often do, with kind of a broad thought leadership idea. So this is this idea, and this is from a study that McKinsey did, really focusing on this concept of customer journeys. And that's gonna be the theme of my presentation today, really trying to look at how we can maximize the customer journey in solar in order to essentially reverse engineer the most optimal process that your homeowners want, and to really take kind of apathetic, very often lackadaisical experiences that your homeowners might be having and make them really stellar, kind of feel-good experiences that make them want to refer your company. And that's really what you want at the end of the day, right? So what we know is that this customer journey, and when it's done well, is far more critical than individual touch points that you have with your customer. And what that means is that your customer may have negative interactions, as they very inevitably will, probably, with the process at some point. We all know permitting can be a real slog. There are going to be, maybe opportunities for improvement, but that overall experience that they have is really going to drive how likely they are to come back to your company if they have additional needs, and how likely they are to review you effectively and refer customers to the process. And so that's what we're really focused on reverse engineering today. And so we're going to take a step back, from touch points. And it's interesting for us to say this because at a core part of what Bodhi does is create touch points for your customers, but really thinking about how those touch points are a part of a larger customer journey and customer experience. And so today we're going to delve into three kind of main theses or ideas, right? We're going to talk about existing pain points. So we'll look at where I've seen in my implementations a lot of companies go wrong, or maybe do things that could be optimized more effectively. We're going to talk about the customer journey. We spend a lot of time using this term, but what I found is that there's not as much maybe information around what an effective customer journey looks like. So I'm going to give you an example of a customer journey and how you can lay one out internally for your company. And then we're going to really reverse engineer this process and start with your homeowner, really start with how they feel at various points of the journey, and then build out a system that's going to work for you. And I'm going to also provide you with some tools and tips that you can use to build this out at your company. So my goal is for your customers to be as happy as this little creature here on the right. Bonus points to anyone that knows what one of these is called. And because I know that both Scott and Kat at the beginning of the presentation did not know what this was. So if you want to throw that into the chat, little extra points for anyone. And then at the end of the presentation, if we still don't get it, I will tell you what this is. Cool. So I want to delve into these pain points that I see very often in the process. And Jeff, you got it. I knew you would get it. I said to myself in the beginning, I was like, Jeff's going to be the one that gets this first. Let's talk about a few of these pain points and really delve into where some of these challenges arise. So, very often one of the core foundational challenges that I see is that installers very often base a lot of their process off of their internal operations. And I'm also a very process-oriented person. I have to fight the urge to do this, but very often we start with this operations process that we have that really works for us, right? We have a CRM, we have fields in the CRM, we track those things internally. And so we say, great, I am just going to attach triggers to each one of these various processes, and that is going to optimize the experience for my customers. But what happens in reality is that if that's the way you're engineering your customer communications, very often you're going to have moments where the customer gets a notification, the timing is wrong, maybe the notification is really unnecessary, and it just generates more questions than you needed to begin with. And so if you don't have a thoughtful way of thinking through where you get the majority of your requests or questions and how your customers feel when they receive the messaging. Something I've noticed too is very often I'll come to the project managers that I work with and I say, how do you feel about the triggers that you're sending to your customers? And they don't even know what the triggers say, right? Like they know that there's a process happening on the back end and that customers are getting communication, but they may not even realize what the exact messaging is or the moments when that's going out. And so you really want to think through this process in a very different way. And we'll talk about what that looks like a little bit later today. Another thing that often seems great in the beginning, but actually generates a lot of issues is that CRMs are really limitless, right? Very often, not exactly, but very often you can get close to limitless in terms of the number of fields that you have in your CRM. And that makes it really easy to say, great, I have a field for this. I'm going to notify my customer. And instead of being effective, sometimes we bombard our customers with way more information that's really needed. And again, you end up in a situation where maybe if you don't have the time to update these fields as often as you should. A good example of this is I had a customer that every Friday, they would go through and update customers. So they would fill in all these fields at the same time every week. And so instead of updating customers as it happened, they would update customers with 5 different notifications at once, which is kind of, invalidating the reason for notifications in the first place. So the customer is like looking at their phone and they're super confused. So we worked with them to really think about their process and think about the best way to use their process as an effective mechanism for communication. And so we'll think through that as well as a part of the topic today. I think another thing too is there's not really a way to review what you're doing in a standardized way. Even my most operationally focused, effective companies don't have a timeline for necessarily for when they review, when they're communicating with their customers. And my rule of thumb generally is that you should be reviewing this process at a minimum every 6 months. If not more frequently. And I know that's tough. We're super busy. We have so many other things going on, but whatever your communication process is, whether you're using Bodhi, whether you're using other tools for this, I do think it's really critical that you consistently generate a feedback loop. A great way to do this is to incorporate something like an NPS or a survey system. And so we will talk about how you can actually use those systems. We do have some best practice articles we're actually going to be publishing about this specifically. But how incorporating a system like that can give you really strong analytics about when your process is working and when it might need some adjustment or modification. And so we'll delve into that a bit as well. And then finally, the touch points are not necessarily reflective of what your customers need to know at that same moment in time. And this is really where we're focusing the bulk of our webinar today, is how you think through what your customer is experiencing, which is not often the place we start. We think of, well, I have a system. I want to make this as easy as I can for my team and for our processes. But if you really want to think about the end result, your goal is to have your customers be delighted and talk to their friends and neighbors, right, about how fantastic their experience with insert solar company name was here, right? And so starting with that is really the core way we're going to do this. And so all of these sort of feed into this last idea.
Hey, Yana.
Yeah.
On that last point, do you have an example that you can share with folks just as a teaser of how thinking, operationally first and customer second hasn't worked?
Yeah, I mean, I have probably a few, and we'll get into a couple of examples, but I think maybe a good example that I can think of quickly is I've had, there's one in particular that is really common in our setup, which is folks often want to let their customers know when materials are delivered. And there are a lot of challenges, as we know, especially in recent years, that we've had with like supply chain issues, and sometimes some materials are delivered and some are not. And you may want this to be a really specific notification that says, hey, your materials arrived at, the installer location. And this can cause a lot of challenges if there are delays, if you're only getting some specific materials. Like that touch point, in my experience, is very hard to automate at scale. And so that's an example where maybe the customer is expecting some specific notification, and going a little bit broader could be more effective in your communication. You're also kind of providing a little bit more information of like how the sausage is made, right, colloquially, in a way that isn't actually furthering your customer experience or helping their emotions along. And I'll highlight that. Actually, I notice in a lot of customer communication during that kind of permitting and install, there's this buildup of like frustration that very often happens, specifically in that series. And we'll talk about that buildup and why it's really important that we think through that part of the process. But thanks, Scott. I hope that's a good enough example.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right. So with that, let's get into the customer journey. And I want to spend a little bit of time here because as I talk through a lot of these ideas, it's often very hard to showcase or maybe map out what an effective customer journey looks like in solar. I don't know that I've seen a lot of folks talk about this more broadly. And so what I did is I actually modified our internal customer journey to be one that is reflective of a solar customer journey. And this is not by any means perfect. You should absolutely optimize this for your process. I have some installers that go live in 30 days that do their projects incredibly quickly. I have some that take a lot longer, and neither is problematic, right? It's just a question of what makes sense for your timeline. But you can take something like this and you can really adjust it to suit your needs. But I do want to call out a couple of things that I look at when I try to evaluate what an effective way to measure some of these ideas are. So I always like to think about the customer journey in terms of timeframes, how long it takes a customer to really build up that overall experience with your company. And so you'll notice that I've kind of called out the time frame. I've called out specific stages here. Now, again, these could be reflective of your own stages. I sort of organize this in terms of, the beginning part of the conversion from sales to the project, looking then at kind of general engagement. Again, this could be very different. Some companies have a really strong social media presence. Some don't use social media very much. And so you'll want to modify this for your needs, all the way up through kind of what we think of as confirmation and advocacy. But I think what's critical is that you have specific KPIs at every part of the process, and that this is something that you should do with your team to identify essentially, how do we know that what we're doing is effective and that it's fostering a strong customer journey for the people that we work with. So I've called out a few KPIs here at every stage of the process. An example of one after conversion might be that you want to start the project in less than a week. And you may want to call out a specific percentage of customers that you want to hit that KPI. An example of one during the project phase might be that 80% of your projects are done within whatever your time frame is here. I said 4 months. That may be really doable for some companies, not as doable for others, but and you can kind of go through this list, and we'll share this deck for anyone if you want to reference this slide, because I know there's a lot on here and we're not going to get through all of this, but I think the main goal and the main takeaway is that you need to set something that indicates that you are being effective at every one of your respective customer journey stages, or else you're kind of struggling with this idea of not knowing whether or not you have an effective goal. The other thing too is sometimes you may not know what a metric is because you may not be working in kind of the customer experience space. There are a lot of resources to determine what effective metrics are, but what very often happens is there isn't really an effective answer because what your baseline might be, it might be very different than in other companies. And so sometimes you just need to set a goal and see where you are towards hitting that goal and then rebaseline that. And kind of down as you experiment and try to determine what an effective strategy is for your company specifically. Then I like to note activities at every one of these stages. So what are activities that project managers might be taking? What are activities internal operations folks might be taking? And then also, what are your homeowners doing at various stages of the process that indicate that they are interacting with your company? For some companies, maybe homeowners are just not particularly interactive, and that's okay. Maybe you're focusing more on internally what you're doing to reach out to customers, identify new opportunities, identify referrals, et cetera. But I have a couple of clients that have really great social media strategies and continue to use email campaigns and marketing to reach out to their customers long after their project is completed in order to generate additional content, talk about their volunteering efforts. They maybe send sort of email campaigns around weather patterns, things like that. We'll talk about that a little bit. And so identifying what those are for your team is really valuable. And then finally, kind of looking at your internal analytics. What are valuable things that you should be reporting on? And I find this is a really big opportunity for growth for a lot of my customers, is really thinking through effective ways to generate some of these analytics. This is a big part of what we're going to be working on with Bodhi in the coming quarters. But in general, CRM tools are really effective in that you have all of these fields that you could be using to report on some of these metrics. I've thrown out a couple of examples here of things that might be really valuable for your team to think about as you go through the process of determining where you want to make improvements or how you can be more effective in that various stages of the process.
Hey, Yana, one follow-up question here on this customer journey. How do you see, questions that the customer have during this process? How does that play a role in this crafting of this customer journey by the company?
Yeah, and we'll talk about that. Actually, it's a good segue in kind of the section of reverse engineering this process. You can, if you wish, add a whole additional section here of customer questions. I'm going to dive into a spreadsheet that I use to reverse engineer and get to this point, essentially. So this is sort of like my final product. This is what I present to my leadership team. But if you're starting that reverse engineering process, starting from questions and when you're getting those questions interactions is actually a fantastic way to build this. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in the final section.
Awesome, thanks.
I don't see any questions. So I'm going to move on to kind of the main idea in your customer journey, which really goes back to that very first concept that I talked about at the beginning of the webinar, which is that the most important thing you're really focusing on is, and I know this sounds a little bit esoteric, right? But you want to think about how your customer feels in their interactions with you. This is going to be the main driver. And we know from studies, and I can link to a number of them as well, that the way people feel is actually much more important than what people think. We tend to justify our feelings when we're making a decision about our experience with whatever company you're interacting with. And so I'm going to use a good example to talk about this. So what is a good customer experience? So I am a Midwestern mom. And so a big part of my life is spent going to Target, much to my husband's chagrin. There are many jokes about this. I'm very stereotypical in my love for this particular store. And I very often place drive-up orders because they are super convenient and I have 2 young children and I want to be in and out and I don't want to actually have to walk into the store, which will just induce me to spend 3 times as much as I would have anticipated on spending originally. But I want to call this out. Has anyone, and feel free to raise your hand, has anyone ever used the Target drive-up app? I don't know if there are any other Midwestern moms here. Scott is a hearty no. All right, cool. So if anyone is, so for those of you, it sounds like most of you will not use this. Basically what happens is you place an order, and I like this model because it is very clearly automated. And it's similar to a little bit of what we talk about here at Bodhi on a consistent basis, right? You place your order, it gives you a notification that your order is being prepared. There's no additional information, right? I'm not getting bombardments of oh, I'm going to get your chair and I'm going to place it on this, right? It's just what I need to know. Your order is being prepared. The average wait time is this. By the way, if the wait time is delayed, I get an automated notification that indicates that that's the case. And then when I pull up to the store, right, it's super easy. I can tell them I'm coming. They'll actually track my car. They know when I get there. I will tell them what space I park in, and then they will bring out my order and I tell them where to put it in my car and they will throw it in my car for me, which is incredibly convenient. And if they're running late, I get an automated notification that says, we're sorry you've been waiting for so long. It's resetting those expectations. And for anyone that attended our last Bodhi Inbox webinar, we talk a lot about this idea that resetting expectations is really critical in your customer's perception of how effective you are as a business. And so I like some of the comments about Target. I bring this up here because I think what they've obviously done is thought about their target demographic, of which I'm obviously a part, and really engineer this process to be efficient, focused on what information I need, removing all of the information I don't need, and at the end, getting me what I want, which is to incentivize me to come back and shop with them more frequently, which I heartily do, and I'm ashamed of how much money I spend with them. So let's kind of talk about how they reverse engineered this process and apply that to your own business. So we have a poll for you, actually 2 polls, that we want to get a sense of, a couple of things around your customer experience. So Kat has thrown up the first poll here, which is focusing on how your customers feel. You shouldn't feel obligated to respond, but we do want to just get a sense of do most of you feel that your customers love you? Do most of you feel that your customers can be frustrated? Is it something else? And you can throw that answer in the comments, but go ahead and take a second to answer the poll. And I'm very curious to see kind of how that impacts our conversation today.
The one thing that we found, and I tell a lot of folks about it, is that, it's ironic how it's generally the customers who have an issue early on in the process. And if you're able to address that particular issue that they have and address it satisfactory to their to what they want, those are the folks who turn into the biggest champions down the road. So they may start off kind of annoyed, so they may give you a 2-star on the customer satisfaction survey, but then you address it and then they become delighted at the end of it. So,
and they become your biggest promoters, right? actually, this is true in tech as well, right? If you can have someone overcome a really dire situation, very often they become very committed and very excited about using.
Anybody else? You got 5 seconds left to answer this question, and I'm going to share in the poll and share it as well. So I'm going to share the results. What we see is that about 36% are delighted. So you guys are doing actually a pretty good job out there. Some definitely frustrated, apathetic. And what's great is that there are no angries. That's really good to hear. But we've got a few of those that have written the others. So we've got that. So we've got one additional poll, which I think is a compliment to this one. So I'm going to share that, launch that now. It's now, how do you feel? What word best describes how you feel about your customers' opinions? Delighted, frustrated, angry, apathetic, or this time, all of the above. I think one of the toughest things for folks in customer service, customer success, is that you generally hear about all the bad situations, all the issues, all the complaints, and folks who are satisfied, they may, a lot of them don't actually voice that. And so it is a tough, customer service is just really tough. And I think that's kind of why in other industries, it's had very high turnover as well. But so being able to solicit feedback, I think, is really important, so that to give that opportunity for the satisfied customers to say, hey, you guys are doing a great job. We are very much delighted by that. So share the results here. And I think what's great is that the majority is delighted. So I think oh no, Yana, you feel like you're preaching to the choir from the 2 different polls that we just did.
I think that at the end of it, we're always trying to improve the process. So really, when we target, the way that I think about the customer journey is you're going to have a bell curve, right? And really how effective you're going to be is actually less about the customers in the middle if you're doing an overly good job. I think it's actually more about targeting the customers on either end of the bell curve, right? Really taking advantage of your promoters and then leveraging that in a way that works for your business, but then also doing something about these distractors that are really bringing down, right? Like they actually say that for every negative review, you need 20 positive ones in order to offset your customer or your company reputation. And so I think it's for every one of those negative reviews that we can turn into even a moderate, right? Like even the middle of the road sentiment, you're doing a huge service to your company. And so I think mapping up the customer journey will inevitably do that, where you're able to effectively leverage your, really top performers. And we'll get into this a little bit, but then also identify who your detractors are and kind of reduce that noise, right? So kind of, I think that everyone here cares about the customer experience or they wouldn't be here in a sense, right? But I think there's a lot we can do to improve that. So cool, thanks for bearing with us on the polls. That was really insightful. And cool. And we'll get through some of these comments are great. I want to talk a little bit about kind of how we start with the questions. Scott brought this up a little bit, right? So one of the first things that I do when I start this process, and this is how I recommend this idea of like reverse engineering, which is that you start with the questions. Where are your customers asking the most questions? And then we're going to talk about how you plug them into this overall sentiment analysis, and then how you build out your customer journey to get to what I got to with that final end result. And couple of common questions that we see, right? I'm sure you guys have seen at least some of these, if not all of them at various stages. There are many, many more. What I do is I kind of write them all out and then I start to bucket them, right? So think through, in particular, the ones that I would highlight are the ones that are the easiest to get ahead of or automate, right? I would also start to, even in this part of the process, even however you want to mark it up, smiley faces, frowning faces, colors, right? Whatever you want to do, identify which ones are the most painful. So I know, for example, like, why were parts left on my property after installation? I've seen this question every so often, and it seems like this particular issue may not be a pain point for 98% of customers, but for the ones that it is a pain point for, it is a huge pain point, potentially, right? I've seen that be kind of an example. Other ones are kind of more just, hey, FYI, this is just good service, right? Like the last one, like, do I need to clean my panels regularly? You probably get this question a lot, but it's not necessarily indicative of how happy or frustrated your customers are. And so you may want to mark that differently. So then what we're going to do is, once you have your list of questions, you've kind of gone through this process systematically, you're going to map out your customer experience. So I use this example. I just like drew this out on my iPad of what I've seen as being a general experience. Now, for you, the experience might be very different. You may not have any of these issues. You know, you might have high points where I have low points. It doesn't matter. The goal is that you do know exactly what those specific touch points are. So I've laid it out in terms of the phases. You could do it however you want, but your goal is to identify specific triggers of when your customers might be very frustrated, and try to think of, you can, talk about outliers. What I've done here is, for example, you'll notice in the build section, the majority of customers have, a reasonable, experience, but you might have a couple of outliers, right, where they might get really frustrated because of that supply issue that we talked about that may or may not be an issue for you. So call those out. Call out where the journey may also be different for some of your customers or some of those outliers versus the base. And what I do here is I identify those specific touch points. And then I also think about, hey, okay, so at these really green parts of the journey when customers are delighted, what can I do to take advantage of that specific touch point to make sure I'm sort of catching all of that excitement and all of that emotion in a way that benefits me, right? And benefits the customer. So obviously, like, those are the points at which we want to think about where we send referrals or review requests, or maybe reach out to the customer and say, hey, we really appreciate you. We're so glad that you're excited. Maybe this is an opportunity for your CEO to get involved. Whatever you want to do here, think about it very much in the context of this process. Very often, I think, again, we look at like our CRM and we say, well, we send this over here and this is the right time to do it. But if you actually map this out, it gives you a visual representation of these moments in a really concrete way. And then again, at those negative points, you don't want to send a referral request during permitting, right? Like, probably not going to go well for you. And so if that's a real pain point for some of your customers, and I know, like, I have a client on here that's a part of this webinar where, like, you guys don't have this problem, right? You do your builds in 30 days and permitting's not an issue for you. That's awesome. But for a lot of folks, this can take weeks, months, right? Think about what you can do to really mitigate that process. And so you might be sending auto updates. You might be reaching out to your customers and inquiring about other things, just showing them that you understand that they're frustrated, but that you're here for them and that you care. But identifying this gives you a way and a blueprint to think through this process effectively. Okay, and then from here, and as I promised, I will share this whole spreadsheet with you that I've built out. I like to build something like this. And the way that I think about this spreadsheet is it goes from left to right in terms of identifying kind of the specific event, the customer sentiment in that moment, the customer emotions. And I also try to identify, like, what I like to call the trough of despair. This is a term that's used affectionately in startups, but I actually like to use it here as well. Specifically, like, you'll notice that there is sort of this happy place in permitting where, like, the permits are sent, everyone's happy. Then there's a permitting delay. Then very often the scheduled installation might get moved or delayed, and so the customer becomes frustrated. Then you might have, like, materials left on the property, the customer gets angry, and then you have your installation and the customer has this high point again. But trying to identify, like, where are there opportunities where we're really escalating or exacerbating that process, and how do we identify our goals to improve that is really critical. So I map out kind of my CSAT here, think through the customer emotions, think about the questions, right? So this is where we're going to plug in all those questions and identify where they fall. Scott, if you're talking.
Yeah, just to clarify, those questions, that column questions, those are the customer questions, right?
Yeah, so these are the questions that we talked about in that first part. So all the questions that your customers are asking, you're going to sort them by the specific stage or the phase of the process. And then you're also going to now have a visual to identify those questions with the CSAT. You could even, if you wanted to, add an additional column here that so every question has its own sentiment marker. Do with this what you will. But I think this is it's a kind of a starting point. And then what you can't see on this spreadsheet that I will show you kind of when we share it after the kind of the meeting is that beyond sort of the goal, which is your goal of obviously improving this process, there are categories for operations and then the status of that, the CRM and the status of that. And then if you're using a tool like Bodhi or whatever other tool you're using, and the status of that to indicate the actions that you're going to be taking. So you can see the operations as an example here, right? So your operation goal for the customer search the project is to track the NPS by sales rep. And so then there might be a status that you're identifying in terms of creating whether it's a report or an algorithm, whatever you're doing internally. And then in your CRM, you might need to add a field for that in order to measure that. And then in Bodhi, you may need to integrate Bodhi's NPS system into your CRM, right? And figure out a way to do that operationally. So you're sort of starting instead of starting from the right, as we often do with the operations and saying, I have a CRM field for this, I've got a field for that, right? We are thinking through it much more in terms of these opportunities, and then instead saying, well, maybe I don't need to send a notification here. I could actually change my operations in order to make this process more effective. Or maybe I need to remove this because it's providing a lot of pain points for my customer. So you're really thinking about it from the way that they feel. And if something is working great, then you don't maybe need to make a lot of changes there. But it also, rather than kind of trying to boil the ocean and trying to do everything at once, this also gives you a prioritization of where the biggest pain points are. So you can start with those and then move in a more systematic way towards the ones where like, okay, we're doing pretty good here, but we can make this better. How can we really think through that process? But it gives you a very clear representation, I think, in a way that we don't often think through. Cool. I know Scott asked for questions, but this is sort of a lot to review. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to kind of review this. I'm also happy to jump on a call with anyone if you want to review the spreadsheet post-fact. So yeah.
How about walking through one specific part of this as an example for everyone? How like take a particular phase event and kind of walking through how that is further down in.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. Well, let's do permanent delay because we spent a lot of time on this particular pain point at Bodhi. So it's a good one for me. So right, permanent delays tends to be in an area where customers might be really frustrated. They might be upset. They might need reassurance. Maybe not everyone, right? But the ones where they're, dragging on for 3 months can be a real problem. So they're really focused on this idea of just like, hey, why is this taking so long? Even if you set expectations around this, again, this goes back to something we've talked about with Bodhi Inbox and this idea that like, you just need to reset that customer feeling, right? Of like, hey, have they just forgotten about me? I haven't gotten any notifications or any kind of communication in 3 months, right? So the goal is to really think about how do you proactively check in with your customer? And this could be a number of different things. You may have an operational process in place, right? So I said here, for example, you may want to identify AHJs that have the longest permitting times. You may know this anecdotally, right? So you might say like, oh, the city in Illinois takes forever. But if you actually have a very clear representation of this, again, you can systematically focus on making sure that those customers get updates in a more effective way. Then what I might do is I might create a reference sheet for your sales reps from an operational side to really start setting the expectations at the very beginning and say, hey, listen, like 80% of it, our permitting takes this long, but these specific AHJs, like if you are talking to a customer in this region, just know that it is going to take a lot longer for those specific customers. So you can really focus on doing that in a more thoughtful way rather than just kind of giving broad ideas. And then kind of in terms of the CRM, I would honestly track make sure, you should have a field for AHJ, right, in there, but I would make sure that you have that field, that you're creating reporting that is enabling you to track that information, and that you're also tracking permitting processes generally. A lot of folks don't even do that minimal component of it. So making sure that you have something that lets you see when it gets moved into the permitting phase and then when it gets moved out of that phase. And then finally, if you're using Bodhi, I'll use Bodhi as a concrete example. You can actually send automated time-based permitting requests. We talk about these a lot. This is a great way to kind of close the loop for your customers, and you can set them so that any subsequent touches invalidate them. I have one client that sets them every 7 days for 60 days. And they have like 8 or 10 of them, right? I can't do math today, but whatever that is, right? And so they have different messaging, right? Just to really make sure that if a customer sits there for 2 months, they're getting a notification like clockwork every 7 to 10 days. And so that's a really effective way to make sure that you have to get creative, right? Like you have to give the customer something that isn't boring and they don't dismiss you out of hand, but at least it lets them know like, hey, we haven't forgotten about you. We're here, we're present. So that's sort of the way that I would engineer that process, sort of soup to nuts. Hope that helps. All right. So we'll share this again. Happy to address any questions around this post fact. I want to just very quickly summarize, right? This whole extended process we went through, right? If you have to bring this back to your executive team or talk about this broadly. So write out your questions, figuring out kind of what the customer sentiment might be during each of those respective questions. You're going to kind of plug them into a sentiment graph, however you want to do that, but identifying a very clear kind of wave pattern for when your customers are excited or not, and then identify certain actions you can take. And then you can kind of reverse engineer your operations to really think about improving the most troublesome part of your journey, and then also really take advantage of the moments when your customers are really excited and delighted. So this is kind of the main crux of what we're going to chat about today. As always, I like to do a quick plug for our knowledge base. For anyone that is not familiar, we do have a knowledge base where we collect a lot of our best practices, including some recommendations for a lot of what we talked about today. I will actually be uploading this webinar onto the knowledge base post fact, and then we will also include a lot of the presentation materials there in addition to sending them to you. So you'll have a way to reference them if you want to downstream. But also I'll kind of leave this open for questions. This is your opportunity to ask any questions around anything that might that we may have covered. So.
All right, so I will take the honor of coordinating that, Yana. So we've got a couple of questions or one question and one other comment I think we should definitely address. So first question is from Mike Kornacek. What is the best way to set customer expectations on how they should experience their upcoming Bodhi journey? How on day 0 do you get them ready to receive the CSAT value, the customer satisfaction value that Bodhi will deliver? So if you can answer that, and then I think also probably touch on the NPS question as well. So as part of that.
I'm going to turn this back on you, Scott. Do you want to take a stab at answering this, and then I'll jump in with my 2 cents? It's a good question, Mike.
That's a great question. So a lot of this setting of the expectation really as best practice should actually start over on the sales side. So I think one of the really key things, and one of the areas that is really challenging for solar, for a lot of businesses, are the handoffs. What's happening when you hand off from sales, when you go from this period where salesperson's actually pretty active and always communicating with the customer? That's because they're trying to get the sale, they're trying to get that deal signed, but then they get handed over. And in that handoff, how much does the operations team know what was promised, what sort of expectations were set? So having a good handoff and understanding that if the sales team can help set that expectations early on, then that will help quite a bit, Mike. So with that, when you then factor in Bodhi, one of the features that we do have is the NPS. And we actually ask for NPS for the customer to submit a Net Promoter Score response twice. First, right when the Bodhi account gets created, normally at that point of contract. And is meant to assess how likely, how are they feeling at that moment? And that's really a gauge of both the sales process and the handoff process. We also ask later on at the end of the project, once the system's turned on, the same question again. And that comparison of the two gets us assessment of like what's happened in that in-between period of time. So I think, does that answer your question, Mike, on how from day 1 or day 0 we can get that those surveys or that at least some initial insights into customer sentiment? And maybe Yana, if you have other questions you want to, or other comment.
I mean, I would say I agree. I think that transition is really critical. I know that a lot of our companies do welcome calls and they're very meticulous about making sure that their customers understand, right, that they're going to have access to this app and this portal, and they may actually sit with the customer as they log in for the first time, just to make sure that they're really comfortable around that process. I do think that is a best practice. Not everyone can afford to do that, but if you can really walk them through it, let them know that all of their updates and all of their information will live in this app. So for Bodhi specifically, that's a really great way to make sure that you're continuing that conversation they hopefully started with the sales team that talks to them about like, hey, by the way, one of our differentiators is we have an app where you'll be able to track your progress. And so that's a good starting point. For anyone that may not have these, if you're a Bodhi customer, we do have these like QR code sheets. And I think not everyone has them, but we're happy to create them for you. They basically let your customers just scan a PDF and download Bodhi quickly. So if you, for any reason, did not get one and need one, please reach out to our CS team and we'll happily make one for you so that your sales team can really start this process and make that handoff a lot easier.
Cool. Great. And so there was this other comment earlier in the chat, and this is from Yana. I think some customers don't understand the scoring. We'll get 3 out of 5, but they'll say everything is great. When we ask, they say they are happy and that 3 is good. So setting up what the number / scoring stands for.
Yeah, I think, I've done this. I've actually think the best people that do this are car companies. I don't know if anyone's bought a car in the last couple of years, but I had to buy a car in like November. And one of the things the salesperson said to me was, if you give me anything less than a 10, then I don't get paid. Now, I don't know if that's actually true. Right. But like that made it very clear what the stakes were of understanding the scoring system. And so I do think that if you're not talking to your customers about the importance of this, or that this is something you're really taking, and giving them a metric against which to kind of compare how they're rating you, I think you're missing out on a really valuable opportunity to solicit feedback. And so that's another thing kind of too that I would talk about during the welcome call is, hey, by the way, you're going to get some surveys as a part of this process. We really value these as a way to know that we did well, and maybe even give them a small sheet that kind of outlines, hey, like a 5 is this, a 4 is this, a 3 is this. And so kind of down the line so that they know exactly what they're rating against. And so that rating is a little bit more consistent. You can kind of set a better benchmark that way. And so, you can adopt the model of like, hey, we take it very seriously if you give us anything less than a 5. So just be aware that if you get anything less than a 5, our CEO will personally give you a call to find out what's going on or whatever your bandwidth allows.
Yeah, it was interesting when we're doing the design of the customer satisfaction surveys that are embedded within the app. It was really intended to make sure that if there is any, so this is for all Bodhi customers that are listening in, the intention was that we wanted the customer to actually consciously make the intention of changing the score. So the default setting is a 3, which is considered neutral. So 1 is, if you look on the survey, it's actually poor, and 5 is love it. So 3 is actually a neutral, and therefore, if you do receive anything less than a 3 or anything higher than a 4, that is someone actively saying, I want to provide something different than the default itself. So for those that are listening in, keep that in mind as those scores come in.
Awesome.
Any other questions at all? We've got just a few minutes left in this call. Like Yana said, we've got this recorded, so both the materials, the slides, and the presentation will be both mailed to you, but also be uploaded to the knowledge base. And furthermore, if you have any other specific kind of topics that you'd like to learn more about, we are hosting these webinars, both the customer success specific ones that are more about best practices to more of a general webinars as well. So if you do have ideas or interest in particular topics, feel free to reach out to either Yana or I and we'll try to drum up the right experts in those areas to help share some knowledge with everyone.
Yeah, and we want to just thank everyone for attending. We know it takes a lot to take an hour out of your day to come and listen to our best practices. So we really appreciate all of you coming and participating and asking questions. And as always, we're happy and delighted to work with you post fact as well. So if there's any kind of follow-up conversations or this, you really realize, oh, I have to update my journey, please reach out and we will happily work with you to do that.
One last question for you, Yana. What's one super practical tip that everyone listening in should take away?
Super practical. I mean, I would say, yeah, I mean, I think the main thesis is really the main takeaway, which is that I'm trying to think of how to concisely phrase this. Leverage emojis to determine various points of your customer journey, and make sure you map it out. Start there, because if you don't, you run the risk of running into a lot of operational headaches and not necessarily making any kind of communication as valuable as it could be. So use the emoji tool on your phone, draw some smiley faces, and really make it a nice visual exercise for your whole team. I recommend that you do this with your entire PM team if you can. So that would be I don't know that that's the most practical tip, but
Okay,
that's my main takeaway.
I mean, I think the inbox actually, you will, if a customer sends an emoji through inbox, you will see that within the message thread. So, all right.
Yana, you need to flip the script. Scott, what's one super practical tip you would tell our audience today?
I would say for those Bodhi customers, if you have not already, you should do two things. Enable the NPS score survey, and then two, use our smart time-based touches. So those are two things that if you aren't already leveraging them, or if you don't think you're leveraging them enough, please contact Yana, and her team will help you out there.
Those are good. I harp on that so much that I hope all of my customers know about them at this point. Awesome. Thank you all for attending, and we'll stay on for just a couple more minutes if anyone has any sort of private questions they wanted to ping over. But again, we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.